Angela Harris stepped into the courtroom, her heart steady, her mind focused. She had been here before a few times, but today it felt different. She had become accustomed to the cold marble floors, the high ceilings, and the intimidating rows of seats filled with onlookers. But what unsettled her today was the weight of the eyes upon her as she made her way to the defendant's chair. The judge was already seated, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed firmly on the papers before him. Angela took a deep breath and tried to push aside the growing sense of unease. She had always prided herself on her calm composure, but today it was hard to keep her nerves in check. The case was simple enough, or so it seemed. She had been accused of a public disturbance in the park, a minor misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. Or so Angela believed. She had been trying to mediate a disagreement between two families who had been arguing over a shared space. When things escalated, one of the families had called the authorities, and soon Angela found herself in the courtroom facing a judge who had no idea who she was or the role she played in her community. Judge Thomas Bennett was an elderly man who had spent decades on the bench. He was respected by his peers, known for his strict adherence to the law and his no-nonsense approach to cases. Some called him fair, while others said he lacked empathy. Whatever the case, he was a man of principle, and he believed the law was the law. There was no room for sentimentality or personal biases in his courtroom. Yet as he glanced over at Angela sitting in front of him, he could not help but feel a sense of confusion. She didn't look like someone who would be involved in a public disturbance. She was neatly dressed, her posture was poised and dignified, her presence seemed to radiate calm. And yet here she was facing him, accused of causing trouble in the park. He scanned the papers again, hoping for a different answer, but the details remained the same. Angela Harris had been involved in a confrontation, and now she was here to answer for it. Judge Bennett raised his voice, calling the courtroom to attention. He looked down at Angela and said in a firm tone, "The charges against you or a serious fine will be imposed for your actions." He then proceeded to announce the amount of the fine, a sum that would likely cause a financial strain on some of Angela's standing. She sat there, taking it all in her face, betraying no emotion, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mind racing. She had expected something like this, but the reality of it was still hard to bear. The judge's voice continued, but Angela was no longer listening. Her thoughts were elsewhere, remembering the incident in the park, how she had tried to bring people together, how the situation had gotten out of hand, how she had tried her best to de-escalate things, but it was clear that her actions were misunderstood by those who had called for the authorities in the first place. As Judge Bennett continued his ruling, Angela felt a deep sense of frustration. She knew the law had to be upheld, but she also knew that there was more to the story than what was written on paper. This wasn't just a case of a public disturbance. This was a failure to see the bigger picture, a failure to understand the role she played in the community, a role that had been built over years of quiet service. Yet in that moment, she said nothing. She remained silent, simply nodding in acknowledgement. As the ruling was made, her thoughts swirling as she wondered what would come next. What would happen now that she was officially marked by the system? Angela didn't let the fine define her. She had learned long ago to rise above challenges and move forward with purpose. As the days passed, she returned to her community, where she was known not for courtroom appearances, but for the work she did behind the scenes. Angela had always been the person people turned to when things went wrong, when relationships fractured, when neighbors clashed, or when misunderstandings threatened to tear families apart. She was the mediator, the one who brought peace when there seemed to be no resolution. Her phone rang constantly with requests for help. Her inbox was full of messages from people who needed someone to listen, someone to guide them through tough conversations. Yet in the eyes of the law, Angela was just another name on a docket, another face in a courtroom. She couldn't shake the feeling that the fine imposed by Judge Bennett had made her invisible to the very system she had spent years trying to improve through her mediation work. It was as though everything she had done in her community didn't matter to the authorities. Everything she had built with years of trust and dedication was overshadowed by a single moment in a public park. Her heart ached as she thought about it, how easily she had been dismissed by the very system that was supposed to support and uplift people like her, the people who were working to make their neighborhoods better, one conversation at a time. But Angela wasn't the kind to wallow in self-pity. She had seen too much hardship in her life to let one setback stop her. She threw herself back into her work, offering support to a family torn apart by an argument over a shared driveway, counseling a young couple whose marriage was on the brink of collapse. She listened to their stories and helped them navigate their emotions in a way that felt natural to her. Her approach was always the same: gentle, calm, clear-eyed. She had a way of making people feel seen and heard. She never judged them, but simply helped them find a way forward. She believed deeply in the power of understanding, in the belief that every person had a story that was worth listening to, and with that listening came the possibility of change. Her reputation as a trusted mediator had spread far beyond her immediate circle. People from different backgrounds and communities came to Angela for help when the streets grew quiet and the disputes died down. Angela would often find herself alone in her office, reflecting on the work she had done. Sometimes she would sit at her desk, staring out the window at the familiar city streets below, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. But always she would rise again. She would go back out into the community to meet with those who needed her help, to bring a sense of calm and understanding where there was none. What Angela didn't know was that her reputation had started to reach further than she realized. Whispers of her skill were slowly making their way through local organizations and even reaching the ears of those who worked within the system, like the law offices and city planners, who were beginning to recognize that maybe the work Angela was doing in the streets was just as important as any legal ruling made in a courtroom, perhaps more so. As time went on, the whispers grew louder, and Angela found herself being sought out for more than just casual advice. There were conversations in offices and meetings in rooms where decisions were made that might eventually bring her face to face with Judge Bennett again. But neither she nor he knew how or when their paths would cross next. Judge Thomas Bennett had spent his entire life in the courtroom, following the rules and ensuring that justice was served. But as time passed, he began to feel a sense of unease. Something was missing in his work. He had seen countless cases where the law was followed to the letter, but the outcomes felt hollow or incomplete. He had handed down decisions that followed the procedure, but left him wondering whether they truly addressed the root of the problem in his mind. The law was an absolute, and he prided himself on maintaining order, but increasingly he wondered if there was something more that needed to be done beyond just enforcing the rules. Was there a way to fix the deeper fractures in his community? Was there something more that could be done to heal the growing divisions that he saw outside the courtroom? It was this question that had been gnawing at him for months when a new case landed on his desk, a complicated situation between two local businesses that had escalated into a bitter dispute over shared resources. Both sides were furious, and neither was willing to compromise. Judge Bennett knew this case wouldn't be easy. It would require someone who understood more than just the legal framework. It would require someone who could navigate emotions and find common ground, someone who could help the two sides see beyond their differences and find a way to resolve the issue without a lengthy court battle. As he sat at his desk, sifting through the details of the case, Judge Bennett couldn't help but think back to Angela Harris. He had seen her only once in his courtroom, but something about her had stayed with him. Her composure, her calm demeanor, her ability to remain composed in the face of a ruling that seemed unjust. Those qualities had intrigued him, but what really struck him was her reputation in the community. He had heard whispers about Angela from colleagues and even some of his fellow judges. She wasn't just any mediator. She was someone who had earned the trust of the people in her neighborhood. She was someone who had built bridges between families and businesses in ways that most people couldn't even begin to understand. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Angela's skill set was exactly what he needed for this new case. She wasn't just a mediator, she was a problem solver, a communicator, someone who could help bring the two businesses together and find a peaceful solution. Judge Bennett hesitated. He had initially doubted her ability based on his brief encounter with her in the courtroom, but as he read through the case, he realized that maybe he had made a mistake. Perhaps his initial judgment had been clouded by his biases. Maybe Angela's approach was the kind of solution he had been missing in his career. Maybe she was exactly the person he needed to address this case in the way that he couldn't on his own. After much deliberation, Judge Bennett made the decision he would call Angela Harris and ask her to mediate the case. He wasn't sure what would happen, or how she would respond, but he felt it was worth the risk. For the first time in years, he wasn't sure about the law being the only answer. Maybe Angela could bring something to the table that the courtroom had long overlooked. Maybe there was more to justice than what he had been practicing all these years. And as he picked up the phone to make the call, he felt a sense of nervous excitement, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. Angela was caught off guard when she received the call from Judge Bennett's office. It wasn't something she had expected after her appearance in his courtroom months ago. She had thought that was the end of it, that her brief moment in front of him had sealed her reputation as just another name in the system, another case to be filed away forgotten. Yet here she was being contacted by the very man who had fined her for an incident she believed was misunderstood. The message on her voicemail was clear. Judge Bennett wanted to meet with her about a case involving two local businesses. He had been asked to oversee a dispute that had grown out of control, and he needed someone who could mediate the situation. He had heard about her work from other people in the community and wanted to see if she could help bring the opposing sides to the table. At first, Angela hesitated. She was no stranger to conflict resolution, but she had always worked in the community. She had always been the one to bring people together without the involvement of the law. She had never really considered working directly with the court system beyond the occasional advisory role. But something about the tone in Judge Bennett's voice made her curious. He wasn't just calling because he was required to. He seemed to genuinely believe that she could be of help, that her approach might be the missing piece he needed to resolve this dispute. Angela wasn't sure what to expect, but she agreed to meet with him, unsure of what kind of person she would encounter this time around. The meeting was set for the following morning, and when Angela walked into the courthouse, she felt a familiar sense of unease. The sterile atmosphere, the high ceilings, the echo of footsteps on marble floors. She had spent years working in her community spaces, where conversations took place in living rooms and backyards, where she could feel the pulse of the neighborhood in every interaction. This place felt distant, foreign, like a world she didn't belong to, but she reminded herself that she was there for a reason. And no matter how out of place she felt, she would do her job the same way she always did, with clarity and calm. When she arrived at Judge Bennett's office, she was greeted by his assistant and led into the judge's chambers. He stood up from behind his desk when she entered his office and extended his hand. Angela took it with a firm but polite shake. She could sense the tension in his posture, the awkwardness of their interaction. But there was something else too, an openness, a recognition that perhaps he had misjudged her the last time they met. "I'm glad you could come, Miss Harris," Judge Bennett said, his voice softer than it had been in court. "I've heard a lot about your work, and I think you might be just the person we need for this case." Angela smiled politely but said nothing. She wasn't sure how to respond, not yet trusting the judge's sudden change of heart. "I appreciate the opportunity to help," she said after a moment of silence, "but I'm curious why you decided to call me." The judge hesitated before answering. "Well, I've come to realize that the law alone isn't always enough. Sometimes there are deeper issues at play, things that can't be solved by a ruling. And I've seen that in this case." He paused as if gathering his thoughts. "I need someone who can look beyond the surface and help these two businesses find common ground, someone who can help them understand each other." Angela nodded slowly. She could see the sincerity in his words, but she also knew that words alone weren't enough to build trust in a relationship. It would take time, effort, and openness on both sides to truly make a difference. She had been in this situation before, working with people who didn't always want to listen or understand. But she had always believed that if people were given the chance to hear each other, they could work through anything. "I'll do my best," Angela replied, "but it won't be easy." Judge Bennett nodded. "I know it won't be, but I think you're the right person for the job." As the meeting came to a close, Angela left the courthouse with a sense of both uncertainty and curiosity. She wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like the work she was doing might actually make a difference in a place where it was needed most. The mediation session began with a sense of unease in the air. Angela arrived early, as she always did, to prepare herself for the delicate task at hand. The two businesses involved were on opposite sides of a bitter dispute that had dragged on for weeks. One was a well-established local restaurant that had recently expanded, while the other was a newer boutique shop that had begun to feel the pressure of the restaurant's growing presence. The restaurant claimed that the boutique's deliveries were obstructing their customers, while the boutique owner argued that the restaurant's large outdoor seating area was taking up valuable space. Each side had become more entrenched in their position, unwilling to bend, and now they were standing face to face in the same room, with Angela as the bridge between them. Judge Bennett had given Angela full control of the mediation, something that surprised her. He had watched quietly from the sidelines, though his presence loomed large in the room. Angela had dealt with disputes like this before, but this felt different. These were businesses, people with reputations, livelihoods, and pride on the line. She could feel the tension between the two parties, and she knew that her job wasn't just to mediate the dispute, but to repair relationships that had been fractured by months of resentment and misunderstanding. As the two business owners took their seats across from her, Angela began with the same approach she always used, asking each party to share their perspective, not to argue, but to explain their feelings. The restaurant owner, a middle-aged man named Greg, started by listing the numerous inconveniences he claimed the boutique's deliveries had caused. He was angry, his voice rising with each complaint. The boutique owner, a young woman named Mia, responded with a similar level of frustration, detailing how the restaurant's expansion had pushed her shop to the edge of financial viability. The air was thick with accusations, and Angela could see that they were both exhausted, their emotions spilling out unchecked. She allowed the tension to simmer for a moment before gently interrupting. "I understand that both of you feel wronged in this situation," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But what I want to know is what both of you need to move forward. What would resolution look like to you?" Greg paused, taken aback by her question. For the first time, he was forced to step outside of his defensive position and think about what he truly needed, not just what he wanted. Mia, too, seemed caught off guard by the question. Neither had considered that a middle ground was even possible. The next few hours were a delicate dance. Angela skillfully guided them through their grievances, helping them reframe their perspectives. She reminded each side that their businesses weren't in competition with each other, but rather part of a larger community. She gently prodded Greg to see how his actions were impacting Mia's small business, and she encouraged Mia to appreciate the success Greg had worked so hard for. Slowly, the walls began to come down, and they started to listen to each other's words instead of focusing solely on their own needs. At one point, Greg softened. "I didn't realize how much pressure you were under, Mia," he admitted, his tone changing. "I just saw you as a competitor." Mia nodded. "And I didn't consider how much effort went into your expansion, Greg," she replied. "I just saw you taking up more and more space." By the end of the session, the two business owners had agreed to a shared solution that included designated delivery hours and an expansion of shared outdoor seating. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, one that both sides could live with, and most importantly, it was a solution that preserved their dignity and their livelihoods. Angela stood up, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. The conflict had been resolved, but more than that, she had helped these two people see each other as partners rather than adversaries. As she left the room, Judge Bennett approached her. He gave her a nod of approval, though there was a hint of surprise in his eyes. For the first time, he realized that Angela had done something he could never have accomplished with the law alone. She had healed the cracks that had formed between people, something that the courtroom rarely had the power to do. "Thank you, Miss Harris," he said, his voice genuine. "I think I understand now why your approach works." Angela smiled, but it was a smile tinged with the knowledge that this was only one small victory. There was still so much work to be done. But for today, she had helped create a space where two people, so different, had found common ground. The success of the mediation between Greg and Mia spread through the community like wildfire. Word quickly reached the local business associations, and soon, other businesses were requesting Angela's services. She had expected the mediation to be a one-time situation, a single case handled for Judge Bennett. Instead, it became the beginning of something much larger. The ripple effects of her work were felt not just within the business community, but among families, schools, and even local government organizations. Angela's phone was constantly buzzing with new requests, and her inbox was flooded with messages from people who had heard about her approach to conflict resolution. She had built a reputation as someone who not only solved problems, but did so in a way that brought people closer together, something many hadn't thought possible before. Despite the growing demand for her services, Angela never lost sight of her roots. She remained grounded in the work she had always done, helping individuals, families, and small groups navigate their challenges. Her heart was in the neighborhoods where she had spent years building trust, and that's where she returned each evening after a day of professional mediations. But now something was different. As she worked to help others, she was beginning to realize that her work wasn't just about resolving disputes, it was about changing how people thought about conflict itself. She was no longer seen as just a mediator in isolated cases, but as a bridge, a connector between people who had been divided by misunderstandings, pride, or fear. As the weeks went by, Angela found herself increasingly drawn back to Judge Bennett. The two would meet occasionally to discuss the cases she had worked on and to evaluate their progress. The judge had begun to see the broader impact of mediation in the legal system. He had come to understand that resolving conflicts wasn't simply about enforcing the law, but about addressing the deeper, often unspoken issues that people brought into the courtroom. While he was still deeply committed to upholding the law, he now saw the importance of creating space for understanding and reconciliation, a concept that had been foreign to him when he first encountered Angela. One afternoon, Judge Bennett called Angela into his office for a meeting. This time, however, the tone of the conversation felt different. There was no case to mediate, no business dispute or family argument on the table. Instead, he sat across from her with an air of quiet contemplation. He had been reflecting on their conversations over the past few months and on the broader implications of her work. "Ms. Harris," he began, his voice more thoughtful than usual, "I've been thinking a lot about what you do and how it's changed the way I see things. You've not only helped people solve their problems, you've shown them a way to rebuild their relationships. You've brought a level of humanity into this that I haven't seen before." Angela listened carefully, knowing that this wasn't just a simple compliment. She could sense that something significant was coming. "I've been thinking about how the legal system works," Judge Bennett continued, "and how often we get caught up in the technicalities, the black and white of the law. But people's lives aren't black and white. They're full of complexities, emotions, and histories. I think I might need your help with something bigger." Angela raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you mean?" The judge leaned forward slightly, a spark of hope in his eyes. "I've been considering a pilot program, a way to integrate mediation into more cases before they even get to trial. Something that could offer people a chance to resolve their issues peacefully, without the need for a courtroom battle. But I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows how to work with people, someone like you." Angela was taken aback. She hadn't expected the conversation to turn in this direction. It was one thing to mediate a few cases. It was another to be asked to help shape the future of the legal system. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, feeling a mix of excitement and uncertainty. "This sounds like a huge undertaking." "It is," the judge replied, "but I believe it's the future. People don't want to go to court. They want to find a way to make things right without the burden of legal battles. You've proven that it's possible." For a moment, Angela sat in silence, weighing the offer. It was a monumental shift, not just for her, but for the entire community. Could she really take on such a responsibility? Could her work in the neighborhoods translate into something on such a large scale? "Let's do it," she finally said, a sense of purpose filling her voice. "Let's change the way things are done." As Angela agreed to help Judge Bennett shape the pilot program, a sense of excitement mixed with apprehension settled over her. This was no longer just about resolving individual conflicts. It was about creating a systemic shift, a movement that could transform the way people interacted with the legal system, offering them a pathway toward understanding rather than confrontation. The enormity of what she was about to take on was daunting, but Angela had always thrived when facing challenges. She believed that change was possible, even when it seemed impossible, and this was her opportunity to prove that belief. Over the next few weeks, Angela and Judge Bennett met regularly to outline the framework for the pilot program. They worked alongside city officials, legal experts, and community leaders, brainstorming ways to incorporate mediation into pre-trial procedures. The plan was simple but ambitious. Instead of waiting for cases to escalate to full courtroom trials, they would offer people a chance to resolve disputes through mediation right from the beginning. It would be a voluntary program, one that allowed participants to choose a peaceful path without the threat of a protracted legal battle. The goal was to reduce the emotional and financial toll of litigation, while also fostering a sense of cooperation between disputing parties. Despite the challenges of creating such an unprecedented system, the program quickly gained support from both the public and local officials. People were drawn to the idea of resolving conflicts without the need for lawyers, courtrooms, or months of waiting for a trial date. Word spread quickly about the new initiative, and soon Angela was receiving phone calls from people all over the city, families, business owners, even local schools, requesting her mediation services. There was a clear need for someone who could bridge the gap between people, someone who could teach them how to communicate and empathize with each other. It was as though her work had struck a chord, not just in the courtroom, but in every corner of the community. As the first cases were processed through the new program, Angela found herself busier than ever. She worked tirelessly with participants to guide them through the mediation process. Some came with open minds, eager to resolve their issues. Others were skeptical, unwilling to trust the idea of mediation over the legal system. But Angela's patience and skill began to break down the walls of resistance. She helped individuals understand that mediation wasn't about weakness, it was about strength. It took courage to confront your own feelings, to listen, and to work together toward a solution. Slowly, even the most reluctant participants began to see the value in this approach. The success of the program was undeniable. Cases that once would have dragged on for months or years were being resolved in weeks. Relationships were being mended, businesses were able to move forward, and families found a way to heal. But as Angela watched the program grow, she also realized something important. This wasn't just a shift in the legal system, it was a cultural shift. People were beginning to understand that conflict didn't have to be a battleground. Disagreements didn't have to result in fractured relationships. There was a way to disagree and still move forward together. Despite the increasing success of the program, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that there was more work to be done. Mediation was making a difference, but there were still so many people who were reluctant to embrace the process. The system was still new, and there were those who clung to old beliefs about justice and power. Angela knew that changing hearts and minds would take time. She had learned long ago that transformation didn't happen overnight. It required perseverance, compassion, and an unwavering belief that things could be better. One afternoon, Judge Bennett called Angela into his office again, this time with a new challenge. He told her that the pilot program had caught the attention of other cities, and they were interested in replicating it. He could see the potential for it to become a model for the entire state or even the country. This was the moment Angela had been waiting for, but it also made her realize the true scope of the work ahead. "Are you ready for this?" Judge Bennett asked, looking at her with both pride and uncertainty. Angela paused, considering the enormity of what he was asking. She had been a part of something transformative, but the road ahead would be even more challenging. There was much to do, and many people to convince, but she knew in her heart that this was her calling. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady. This is only the beginning. The news of the mediation program's success spread far beyond the local community. As cities across the state and even the country began to take notice, Angela's life took on an entirely new trajectory. Invitations to speak at conferences poured in, and legal experts from around the country sought her advice on how to integrate mediation into their own systems. What had started as a small initiative with Judge Bennett had now blossomed into a nationwide movement, one that was changing the face of conflict resolution. Angela felt the weight of this success, but with it came a new kind of responsibility. She was no longer just a community mediator. She was a pioneer, leading the charge for a new approach to justice. Despite the growing demands of her newfound role, Angela never lost sight of what had brought her here in the first place. She continued to return to the neighborhoods where she had started, where her work had always been about more than just resolving conflicts. It was about empowering people to understand each other, to listen, and to find common ground. She met with families, schools, and local organizations, ensuring that her roots remained firmly planted in the community that had supported her from the beginning. Yet, as her influence expanded, so did the complexity of her work. She found herself balancing the needs of large-scale programs with the personal, intimate work she had always valued. It was a delicate balance, and sometimes Angela felt overwhelmed by the weight of expectations. But she had learned to lean on the support of those around her, including Judge Bennett, who remained a steady presence in her life. He had become more than just a mentor. He was a partner in this journey, someone who understood the challenges and rewards of their shared mission. Together, they continued to refine the mediation model, making it more accessible and adaptable to different communities. One afternoon, Angela stood before a room full of lawmakers, legal experts, and community leaders at a national conference. She had been invited to share her experiences, to talk about the success of the program and the impact it had made on people's lives. As she looked out over the crowd, Angela realized how far she had come. She was no longer the woman who had been fined in Judge Bennett's courtroom, the woman who had faced skepticism and doubt. She was now an advocate for a new way of thinking about justice, a justice rooted in empathy, communication, and understanding. Her speech was met with a standing ovation, a moment that filled her with both pride and humility. But as the applause echoed in her ears, Angela knew that this was not the end of her journey. It was just another milestone. There were still so many people to reach, so many communities to impact, and so many conflicts to resolve. The work was far from over. As she left the stage, Judge Bennett was waiting for her backstage. His face broke into a rare smile, one that conveyed pride and admiration. "You did it," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I knew you were the right person for this from the beginning." Angela smiled, grateful for his unwavering support. "We did it," she corrected him. "This has always been a team effort." In that moment, Angela realized that the most important part of her journey wasn't the recognition or the accolades. It was the relationships she had built along the way. It was the people she had helped, the lives she had touched, and the communities she had brought together. As the mediation program continued to grow, Angela knew that the true measure of success wasn't in how far the program reached or how many people it impacted. It was in the change it had sparked in the hearts and minds of individuals. And so, as Angela looked out at the bright future ahead, she understood that the work was ongoing. The world had begun to see the power of mediation, but it was her deep belief in the power of empathy and connection that would continue to drive her forward.